The Study of Living Languages, Part 1, by Sir Arthur Cotton. Read for the LibriVox Language Learning Collection, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Preface. The learning of the living languages of foreign, semi-civilized and strange people has now become a matter of such immeasurable importance that any man may be excused who makes the poorest attempt to diminish the difficulties of such a work. Englishmen especially are at this moment employed by thousands as merchants, missionaries, magistrates, etc., in learning hundreds of different languages spoken by people in all stages of civilization, from the lowest state of society upwards, and in their speedy acquisition of a correct knowledge and free colloquial use of several tongues of those tribes, hundreds of millions of the human race are most deeply interested, as that upon which mainly depends both their temporal and eternal interests. Yet I am not aware that there is in existence a single work in which this subject is closely and systematically investigated. It must be observed that the point before us is, what is the best mode of acquiring a knowledge of the language of savage and semi-civilized nations, and that this is in some important respects quite distinct from both the acquisition of dead languages and also of the living languages of nations who have been fully civilized, and consequently have a complete system of literature, a great variety of books of instruction written by extensively informed natives and also thoroughly educated teachers. There are difficulties in learning the languages of semi-civilized and barbarous people which do not exist in the case of languages of civilized nations, and with respect to the dead languages, the principal points to be attended to and the objects aimed at are so entirely different from those in living languages that what is applicable to the one is almost entirely inapplicable to the other. Nothing can be more deplorable than this state of things. The mischiefs arising out of it are incalculable. All without exception who require to know such a language and who make attempts to acquire it lose probably from 3/4 to 19/20 of the time so employed. A large portion lose the whole, breaking down before they have acquired any useful knowledge at all. Probably scarcely 1 in 10 acquires a tolerably correct and free use of it, and scarcely one at all such a knowledge as to make them really effective translators, an office of the highest possible importance. Because the transference of English literature for the great mass of the inhabitants of the earth must precede the formation of a national literature among each tribe. At present it may safely be said that no system whatever is followed in studying such living languages for colloquial purposes. Let any one individual of the thousands who are at this moment so employed be asked, whose system of study do you prefer, or have you any of your own, and upon what grounds do you decide upon this or that point, and his answer would generally be such as to show that he had no clear, definite, well-digested ideas on the subject. Without the least previous investigation of the subject, without spending one single day in reading a treatise on it, or considering it in his own mind, he usually blindly takes in hand a matter upon which he will perhaps employ 1 or several years, taking at a venture, as it were, any books or teachers that he may happen to fall in with, or any ideas he he may happen to have got into his own head, he knows not how or whence, without any solid grounds for concluding whether the mode he is pursuing will lead to an economical or an enormously wasteful expenditure of time, and, what is of more importance, whether he is laying the foundation of a real, correct, and effective knowledge of the language, or establishing himself in a totally false use of it, which, when become habitual, will never be corrected. Matters are in respect of this study of languages just as they were in respect of road-making before the time of Mr. Macadam. Every man thought he was born a road-maker, and those holding the charge of roads did almost anything to them and called it repairs. It was a most common thing, for instance, to throw a thick layer of loose rounded gravel on the road, which at first caused almost the greatest possible resistance to the carriages, and by degrees was converted into mud, but never afforded anything approaching to a clean, hard surface. The road menders were quite satisfied because they were doing something, but if asked why they did what produced an effect exactly the opposite to that which was desired, they of course could not have given a reason. Road making has since been thoroughly investigated, and though men have not yet perhaps found out the best way of doing it, they have now a real reason for what they do, and consequently a prodigious improvement in roads has been produced. It is high time that such a change should take place in reference to this subject now before us, and any attempt at an examination of it with a view to a really sound system of study should be accepted. The thoughts contained in the following paper are the results of such a consideration of the subject as could be given to it in the midst of duties of another kind during a period of more than 30 years. Circumstances have not allowed of the writer following up the study of any language to any extent, having repeatedly moved from where one language was spoken to where another was used, and his time being too much occupied with pressing business, nor has he had any opportunity of commencing the study of a language with such materials as he here recommends, ready prepared to his hands. In the course of this long period, however, he has had an opportunity of trying his plans partially in several languages, both on himself and others, and thus of correcting in some measure his first ideas, and forming something like a digested system in his own mind. And he must state that as to the leading points in the system here proposed, he has quite satisfied himself. He has taken every opportunity of obtaining aid from others, both by reading works of teachers of languages in Europe, and also by trying to discuss the question with those who were studying and had studied such kind of living languages. From the former he has received some help, though often merely by being taught what to avoid, but from the latter he received no assistance, simply because in general they had no distinct ideas at all on the matter, nor any solid reason for anything they had done in their studies. He has, however, got various hints from observing what progress men had made in such studies when using different means. On one occasion he met with a young man who had given his whole time to Arabic for 3 years, and could not then produce a sentence in conversation, and soon after he was intimate with another who in about 8 months, and while loaded with other duties, had obtained, if not an accurate, yet such an effective colloquial use of the same tongue that he regularly transacted extensive business in it with strangers of all sorts without the least difficulty. Again, in India, one meets every day with men who have studied most diligently for 1, 2, or 3 years, and yet all their life after speak a language that both from pronunciation and expression is almost or quite unintelligible to any native, excepting those who, from being about them constantly in an official capacity, have learnt their language, for what they used and called the native language was really a language of their own invention, and so have come to understand them. The writer cannot conclude these remarks without expressing his full assurance that the acquisition of a correct knowledge and perfectly regular colloquial use of such languages will be found to be a matter requiring very little time compared with what it does at present in most cases when a better mode of learning is adopted. On one occasion he had an opportunity of observing the progress made by children in acquiring a new language in a certain time. Out of a number that embarked in a ship in India, many did not know a word of English, having previously used nothing but some Indian language, and they were of various ages. During the 4 months of the voyage to England, every one of them had so perfectly acquired the use of English that they never were at a loss, and latterly seemed to have as good a knowledge of it as those who had always used it. Now, if children of a few years old, without the slightest assistance from teachers or study, could thus pick up a colloquial use of a new language in 4 months, and talk it exactly like one who had never talked anything else, it seems certain that adults with 100 times their power of mind, and with suitable books and teachers, and regular study, could not fail to attain to a real knowledge and ready colloquial use of a new language, and that without being years about it, unless they were altogether wrong in the method of study they adopted. In fact, he cannot help declaring it as his opinion that when the subject is fairly grappled with by men, the great supposed obstacles to intercourse of strange languages will be found, comparatively speaking, a mere bugbear, and that the acquisition of a new language for all the ordinary purposes of life, with a comparatively very small expenditure of time and labour. The study of living languages. Before proceeding to propose a system of study of living languages, it may be well to make some remarks on the mistakes that are commonly made at present, and the chief difficulties that are usually met with, as well as on the time generally expended on such study. A great many of the common mistakes can easily be traced to the circumstance that almost universally the students have previously been accustomed to study dead languages, and from their not observing that almost all their ideas have been formed from that study, while the principal points to be attended to in the study of living languages are exactly those that are of little or no consequence in that of dead ones, and vice versa. In learning Latin or Greek, for instance, the sole objects usually are to be able to read so as to understand the writings of highly educated men, and, but as very secondary, to write elegant formal essays. The following are therefore the leading points aimed at. First, a knowledge of the character. Second, a knowledge of the whole vocabulary of the language, including a multitude of words seldom or never used colloquially in the ordinary business of life. Third, a readiness in perceiving the meaning of long involved formal sentences, such as are found in grave prose and in poetical writings. Fourth, a thorough knowledge of the whole language, so as to be able to give a formal rule for anything when questioned. Fifth, and such a familiar knowledge of the idiom of the language as will enable one to write formal papers in a good style. The points that are of little or no consequence are: first, correct pronunciation; second, an extensive knowledge of the common expressions used in the ordinary business of life. Third, a perfect readiness at recognizing the word by the sound when rapidly spoken. Fourth, the same in forming sentences to express our own thoughts. Now, if we consider these things, we shall perceive that the study of the dead languages and that of the living languages of semi-civilized and barbarous nations are almost diametrically opposed in respect of the objects to be attained. The points that are essential in the one are either non-essential or of no importance whatever in the other, and vice versa. A man may talk a language most fluently, correctly, and usefully for all the ordinary business of life, without knowing the character, without being able to quote a single rule of grammar, without the knowledge of half or 3/4 of the vocabulary of a language, and without any facility in comprehending the involved sentences of formal writings of learned men, while, without an accurate pronunciation, an ample acquaintance with the common colloquial expressions of uneducated people, and a most free and ready use of them, so that strangers can readily catch his words and comprehend his meaning, and without an ear thoroughly exercised in the sounds of the language, so as at once to recognize what is spoken by a native, he has entirely missed his object, though he may know every word in the language and every rule of grammar, and be able to write an elegant essay without a mistake. Books of history, etc., do not furnish us with the expressions of ordinary conversation. Every country has its own peculiar forms, and they must be learnt individually. No rules can be given by which a student who knows the words and grammar can invent them himself. In semi-civilized countries, where not 1 in 100 has read books, there is a large proportion of the words which are never used in conversation on ordinary matters, and which therefore are so far from being of any use to the great mass of those who have to acquire the language, that they are always in his way, if he has learnt them, leading him to express himself in words not in common use, and consequently unknown to most of those with whom he has to communicate. So far, therefore, from it being sufficient to follow the ideas which a man has gathered while studying dead languages, they are in fact the very opposite to those which are correct as respects the study of such living languages as are here supposed. If we examine the mode of study adopted generally, however, it may vary in minor points. The system, so far as that can be called a system, which is indeed no such thing, is that suited to the dead languages. A man takes up a book of stories, a grammar, and a dictionary, and learning almost exclusively by the eye, he proceeds exactly as if the use of his ear were of no consequence, as if he must at once grapple with the whole vocabulary of the language, and as if when he had got the materials of words and rules of grammar, he could himself guess the forms of expression which he must compound from them, like the idiot who was found to have stored up in his box all the wheels, axles, etc. he could lay his hand upon, thinking that when he had got enough he could easily make a clock of them. The results of this proceeding are notorious. A youth in India has passed a splendid examination, knows every word of the language, and has a rule of grammar for everything, loses his way out riding, and can't get home because he is in danger of a stroke of the sun, because he can't make any native he meets understand him, nor can he understand a sentence spoken by them, and this after many months, often a year or two, of intense study from morning to night. And what is still worse, probably he is confirmed in a false pronunciation and a false mode of expression from having almost entirely neglected these two great essentials, or at least not having given them anything like due attention. The consideration of this source of many of the most serious mistakes that are made in this study will be very useful. Another great source of mistakes is that such languages are generally learnt by men at that age when they have most confidence in their own powers, and when they are consequently always disposed to take the bull by the horns. With this feeling, the student generally rushes into the midst of his enemies headlong, attempting to grapple at once with the character, the pronunciation, the whole grammar, the whole vocabulary of 20,000, or, as in Arabic, 200,000 words, the language of books and the language of conversation, etc. No wonder that such a one finds himself continually discouraged, that many give up in despair, that all waste an enormous amount of time and mental effort, and that scarcely 1 in 100 ever talks like a native. Whatever a man's powers may be, it is certainly sheer waste to set about matters in this way, and he cannot possibly receive such clear impressions on his mind as the same person would if he concentrated his attention upon one thing at a time. It may also be well here to advert to some peculiar difficulties which we necessarily encounter in the circumstances in which Europeans are ordinarily placed in semi-civilized countries, and especially in a country like India, in which caste prevails. If an Englishman wishes to learn French or German, he can go and live with a native family, or throw himself continually into the society of natives, in inns and places of public resort, where his ear will be exercised from morning to night in the true pronunciation and the real ordinary expressions of the language, and where consequently, without the least effort even, though indeed slowly, he can hardly help acquiring a correct use of the language, both as respects pronunciation and expression. But there are few countries out of Europe where a European can thus freely associate with the natives, and in India he is effectually excluded from their houses. Separate and special means must therefore be used to exercise the tongue and ear of the student, and to store his memory with a stock of bona fide expressions. Another difficulty is the great inferiority of native teachers compared with European masters. Indeed, in a great proportion of cases, a man has to learn a language with the assistance of one who is not a teacher at all by profession, and who therefore cannot give him 1/100th part of the help derived from a practised and well-instructed teacher. Further, such languages are so extremely different from the European tongues in every respect that a person is much more likely to be discouraged from the difficulties he experiences than in learning a foreign European language, and on this account it is especially necessary to adopt a system that shall, as far as possible, tend to keep up the student's courage. These are some of the leading points that should be kept in view in considering a system of study for such languages. I would now propose some fundamental principles to be taken as clues to the better understanding of the subject. It is evident that there are two fundamental points to be attended to. The first, which is by far of the greatest importance of the two, is to be careful that we lay a solid foundation. This is a universal principle, and as yet one at least as often forgotten in studying languages as in other matters. If a false foundation is laid, the erection can never be made sound. If a man once acquires a false pronunciation or a false mode of expression, he will never get over it. Whatever he learns should be perfectly correct, and not only so, he should have such a thorough knowledge of it that he shall be fully assured in his own mind that his knowledge is correct, so that he may not afterwards be in doubt, and liable to give up what is right, and substitute some guess of his own instead. For want of right modes of study, what numbers use all their lives some language and pronunciation of their own invention, and never find out how it is they can hardly have any intercourse with natives by means of it. The true value and true pronunciation of every word encountered should be fully ascertained, and its use in a great variety of forms of expression should be made thoroughly familiar before proceeding to other words, and no imperfect acquaintance with a word or expression should be allowed. The second great principle is, of course, to save time, but this must always be subordinate to the former. In the main, however, the two principles are not only compatible, but inseparable. Nothing causes so much waste of time as imperfectly learning things, receiving indistinct and shallow impressions of them, because such things are always forgotten and have to be learnt over again. This is the grand reason why such enormous time is wasted in this study. A man attempts so much at once that everything is partially learnt, and forgotten probably at least 100 times over. He begins with a book containing hundreds, more likely thousands of words, and long sentences involving innumerable rules of grammar, and before he gets to the end of it has learnt it in a sort of way, and forgotten every word in it and every expression over and over again, and has probably in the end thoroughly apprehended and acquired a familiar knowledge of not 1/20th part of the words he has met with. He perhaps makes lists of the words that he meets with, and learns many hundreds by heart at once, but he has no useful knowledge of 1 in 20 of them. No word is effectually known till it is so thoroughly familiar that it is ready in his mouth at any moment, without the slightest effort of memory, and till it can be used in a considerable variety of expressions. In fact, till it is just to the student like one of the words of his native tongue, and so wrought in his mind that it cannot be forgotten again. It may, however, often appear that time would be gained by adopting some plan which would endanger the soundness of the foundation, and in this case such a plan must be rejected. The third great principle is to have such a system as shall encourage people both to commence upon and go through with the study of native languages. It is of exceeding importance to encourage all persons, whatever their situations or occupations are, when remaining for a time, however short or uncertain in such countries, to make themselves acquainted, as far as possible, with the language of the people. Numbers at present never attempt it, solely because the usual mode of study cuts them off from all hope of ever attaining to the smallest useful knowledge of it, without such an expenditure of time and labour as they are afraid to encounter, or their circumstances absolutely prevent. A system which shall afford some useful results to every one who enters upon it, and those in some degree proportioned to the time and labour expended, is an immense desideratum. It would lead numbers to make a beginning who now never attempt it, and many such, if they once began, would not rest till they had obtained some considerable knowledge of it. An encouraging system is equally required for those who do at present set themselves to the study with the purpose of going through with it. Nothing can be more discouraging than the means usually pursued at present, whereas if a man were pursuing a system in which he felt at every step that he was making real, useful progress, he would go on with tenfold spirit, always feeling too that, stop where he could, his labour had not been thrown away. In endeavouring to accomplish the first object, the following rules may be laid down. First, the student is really to learn the language and not to attempt to teach himself. For instance, nothing is more common than for a man, as soon as he has learnt a few words, with the help of his grammar, to begin to try and form sentences. In this way he may certainly make a new language of his own, but it won't be the language he proposes to learn. Thus numbers attempt to communicate with natives by English sentences made up of foreign words, which consequently are not merely scarcely intelligible, but often convey no meaning at all, though perfectly correct as regards both words and grammar. The student must not at first attempt to take the smallest step alone. He must not pronounce a word nor put two words together by himself. He must be content to learn everything, and that thoroughly, from a native, sound by sound, word by word, expression by expression, and not attempt to go beyond this, till he has become so established in correct pronunciation, in his knowledge of the correct value of words, and in the actual forms used by the natives, that there is no danger of his substituting something of his own for the real language. It is by no means sufficient to learn a sound or expression once or 10 times. It can only be correctly acquired by exercise, by thousands of repetitions, referring each time immediately to a correct standard. If a man reads for an hour with a teacher, and then goes on attempting to pronounce the words by himself for the rest of the day, he will inevitably acquire a false pronunciation, unless he is so thoroughly established in a correct pronunciation that there is no danger of his losing it, and then indeed abundant exercise of his tongue when alone will be of the utmost use, but this at first is ruinous. Suppose a child were shown the form of a letter, and then as soon as he had a rough idea of it, should go on writing repetitions of it without a standard before him. Anybody can tell what would be the consequence. At the end of a month he would be thoroughly confirmed in writing such a letter as had never been seen before, and if he had occasionally the standard put before him, the consequence would be that 9/10 of his time would be passed in learning to recede further from the original, and the other 10th in trying to get rid of the habit of writing wrong and to bring himself back to what was correct. The same is the case with the student of languages, and in general they are thus constantly employed in partially learning and then unlearning, and the consequence is that even when an approach is made to a correct use of the language, 9/10 of the time employed is needlessly lost. A third point is to learn one thing at a time. If a number of things are pressing upon the attention at once, it is impossible that a distinct and permanent impression can be received by any mind, whatever its powers. Let us consider a person learning a language in the way so commonly followed. He is grappling with a sentence of many words. Here he has at once to consider the character, the meaning of many new words, the pronunciation of them all, the inflections of the nouns and verbs, the syntax, the mode of expression, etc. The consequence is, his attention is so overwhelmed and distracted that his mind is incapable of receiving a clear impression on any one point. No wonder that so little progress is made, that the knowledge acquired is so imperfect and incorrect, and that the student is so constantly discouraged. Often his progress is one continued effort to bear up against the most depressing feeling that he can never master the difficulties, as a man wears himself out sometimes in trying to carry a load beyond his strength, when if he would divide it and carry a portion of it at a time, he would not only accomplish his task, and that comfortably, but would gain strength by the exercise. How many, especially in hot climates, are so injured in their health, not by learning a language, but by the way in which they learn it, that when they have some use of it, they are obliged to lay by for a time, whereas, if they would learn one thing at a time, they would attain to such a clear and sound knowledge, and go on so comfortably, that they would be in no danger of ending without an effective use of the language. A fourth point is to take care to give the whole strength to the really essential parts of the subject. What are the things that constitute a sound knowledge in this case? Certainly not a loose, imperfect idea of the value of almost all the words of the language, with a rough guess at their pronunciation, and the mode of putting them together, the power of reading the character, of understanding a book with the help of time for consideration, of recognizing the words by sight, etc. This is the foundation that is usually laid. Such a student now commences to apply his knowledge of the language to the principal, perhaps the only purpose for which he has studied it, namely conversation. He finds, of course, that his being able to recognize the words when he sees them is of no use to him. He has no facility in recognizing them by the ear, which was the only thing he required. He says the native he is attempting to talk with speaks too fast. The fact is, he has not been learning the one grand thing he has to learn, the use of his ear. Next, he finds his knowing all the words in the language in a certain way is of little or no use to him, because what he needs is the perfectly ready, familiar use of 1 in 10 of them. But he cannot put a dozen together in that ready way which is necessary for conversing. Next, when he has, with much difficulty, put a sentence together, he is paralyzed by seeing a civil, inquiring stare on the countenance of his companion, in consequence of the imperfection of his pronunciation, and the English mode of expression he uses. His failure usually produces utter discouragement, unless he has such a good opinion of himself that he attributes it entirely to the stupidity of the native. In reality, he has been giving the whole of his attention to matters that are of little or no use to him, while he has almost entirely neglected those that are essential. This brings us to the fifth principle, that the language must be learnt by the ear and not by the eye. This is one of the great fundamental mistakes made almost universally in studying living languages. The student never for a moment studies without seeing the words, though he knows that his whole object is to recognize them by his ear, without any assistance from the eye. A man might just as well attempt to train himself for a walking journey by sitting down for a year and turning a winch with his arms, or try to strengthen his limbs by moving for 6 months on crutches. Everybody knows the consequence of this system, but everybody pursues it. From the first, the ear must be the main medium of receiving instruction, and though the eye may be used a little at first, with some advantage, just to help the memory, yet after a little time the ear should be employed alone in conversation. A man may consider he has laid a sound foundation when he has made the following acquisitions. First, the perfectly accurate pronunciation and thoroughly familiar knowledge of a certain number of the most generally used words, however small, so that they are to him exactly as words of his own language, that is, that he has not to search about in his memory for them when he wants them, but that they will come of themselves, and these pronounced so that a native cannot but recognize them. Second, the power of putting these together in a good number of real, bona fide native expressions, however short, without any effort, expressions which he can confidently use, because he knows they are real, as he actually learnt them from a native, and not ones he has invented, and which consequently may or may not convey the meaning he intended, or any meaning. One will often hear a native who has learnt English at a school use a sentence which is unexceptionable as to grammar, etc., but which is objectionable as conveying no meaning whatever to an Englishman. Thus a Tamil man may say in English, "If you see this, that's good," and the Englishman to whom it is addressed cannot even guess what he means to express, though the same expression conveys a clear idea to the Tamulian. Third, an ear so exercised in the sounds of the language that the words spoken by a native, if they have been learnt, are at once recognized by the student, so that what is said within the limit of the student's vocabulary can be apprehended at once without seeing the words written, and without a moment's consideration. Fourth, the knowledge of so much grammar as is necessary to form sentences of a few words only. This is the sort of knowledge of a language that a child of 3 or 4 years old has. He doesn't know a single rule of grammar. He can't perhaps read or write a letter. His whole vocabulary probably consists of 1,000 words. But within the limits of the matters he has to converse about, he can say with perfect freedom and almost perfect correctness anything he wants without a moment's hesitation, and he understands on the instant everything that's said to him, and that even though some of the words used are unknown to him. He has in fact a sound foundation. What he knows is real, and he has only to go on adding to his stock of words and expressions, and to correct some unimportant errors, which, however, are such as do not in the least prevent his being understood. An adult student who has such a knowledge is in a right position, because he can converse within certain limits, and therefore he is in the way of exercising himself in contact with a correct standard, and he has nothing of consequence to unlearn. His progress is not stopped by established habits of false pronunciation and false expression, nor by habitual dependence upon his eyes to assist his memory. His only care then in conversation should be, not to attempt too much, but to content himself with common subjects and simple expressions, and only giving himself more liberty, as by learning he increases his stock of words, expressions, etc. The knowledge of the character has nothing to do with this foundation. It is not in any way an assistance in acquiring it, and it is a great hindrance. A child uses his language freely and correctly without knowing a letter. The character has no connection with the pronunciation of a language, which must be learnt by the ear alone, and the sounds so acquired are just as well represented by the student's own letters as by any others. Neither is a knowledge of almost the whole language necessary to it. The words in common use about ordinary matters form only a very small proportion of the words of a language, and 3/4 of the words which occur in the books ordinarily read are of no use whatever to the beginner. They are, on the contrary, the greatest hindrance to him by preventing his thoroughly learning those that he ought to have a familiar use of. Let us recapitulate the things necessary to form a sound foundation. First, a small vocabulary, thoroughly known and become as familiar as the words of one's mother tongue. Second, an accurate pronunciation of these and the organs of speech thoroughly exercised in them, so that they can be spoken with perfect freedom. Third, so much grammar as is necessary to put these words together in short simple forms of expression. Fourth, an ear so thoroughly exercised in the sounds of the commonest words as spoken by a native that they can be instantly recognized when heard. Fifth, the knowledge of a considerable stock of the commonest expressions of the language, so that the words known can be made into bona fide sentences. When such a foundation has been laid, the student has only to proceed to add more words, more grammar, and more expressions by degrees, only taking care to learn nothing but what is immediately wanted, and to learn thoroughly whatever is learnt at all. When considerable progress has thus been made, he may proceed to learn the character if he requires it, and to read books, etc. Let us now consider more particularly the second main point, namely, to save time. As in other matters, the right way of acquiring a correct knowledge of a language will be found to be suitable for the attainment of this main object also. The things that are necessary to ensure a sound foundation are equally so to secure the saving of time. But we will now consider the details, especially with reference to the latter. The first thing then is to do one thing at a time. Surely this is a principle that will at once commend itself to everyone. We have to learn the character, the words, pronunciation, the grammar, the expressions, etc. Our plan, therefore, should be as far as possible to separate these, and have the attention concentrated upon one of them at a time. This certainly cannot be fully accomplished, but it can be sufficiently for practical purposes. The second is to learn thoroughly whatever is learnt. How can there be any question about the waste of time produced by partially learning things and so forgetting them over and over again? We may safely say that, as ordinarily studied, the meaning of every word, its pronunciation, points of grammar, expressions, etc., are partially learnt and forgotten again hundreds of times over. Everything that is learnt should be so followed up that it may be indelibly fixed in the memory, and be as much part of the student himself as anything in his own language. Third, learn only what is really wanted. Surely this also is most obvious. To learn at first words which will either never be of any use to him, or not till he is far advanced in the language, is entire waste of time. The same with forms of expression, etc. An Englishman never thinks it necessary to learn all the words of his own language. He never knows half of them, much as he reads. And how much must there be in every language that he need never know? The student should first begin with such words as are of universal use in common life, and then, when he has made some progress in the language, commence upon those which are necessary for his particular profession. Even in English there are numbers of words which, though common in books, are never used in ordinary conversation. But this is much more the case in languages in which 99/100ths of the people scarcely ever read a book at all. To the beginner such book words, as he cannot distinguish them from others, are nothing but a serious hindrance to him. Bishop Heber remarks that to make himself intelligible to the great mass of his hearers, who were uneducated persons, he used to find it advisable to confine himself, as far as possible, to words of Saxon derivation, that is, to words commonly used in conversation. If such a precaution were necessary in England, how much more in semi-civilized countries? Can there be any question but that a system of study based upon these principles, by far the largest part of the time usually spent upon acquiring a colloquial use of a foreign language, may be saved? Look at the progress a child makes in a really useful knowledge of a language, whether his first or one picked up afterwards, from being associated with those who speak it with such extremely small powers of mind, without any effort and without any materials. Can it be supposed that an adult with such enormous advantages, with properly prepared materials, and with diligent study, could not make much more rapid progress if he pursued a right system? The system that I would now propose, founded on these principles, is as follows. First, the language is to be learnt through the medium of the English character. The object of this is to get rid of anything which is not absolutely necessary to be learned at first. It may be said that it takes a very little time to learn the native character, and so it does to learn it in a certain way, that is, so that by fixing the thoughts upon a letter and taking a little time for consideration, it may be recollected to represent a certain sound. But it will be a long time before the character is so familiar as to not occupy the attention most seriously, and that at the time when there is the greatest demand upon it. But not only is a known character preferable at first on this account, but it is also superior as a medium to the native character, as being less liable to lead to mistakes. In an Indian language, for instance, in which there are 2 or 3 N's and as many L's, the beginner is always liable to forget which is which. But the plan of noting the sound by English letters, with 1 or 2 dots under those that represent peculiar native sounds, effectually prevents any such mistakes. The dots remind the reader in the readiest manner that they represent such sounds as are those upon which the attention should be especially concentrated. Every letter in the native language must be represented by one certain letter of English, so that the proper spelling may be known. As to the learning of the native character ultimately, if the student should require it, it's the easiest thing in the world when the language is known in other respects, and the whole attention is available for the letters only. The time required for this is most trifling, but even were it considerable, it would still be necessary to learn at first through the medium of the English character, on account of the enormous loss of time arising from having the attention overburthened at first. I therefore reject the native character as being, first, quite unnecessary for learning the language. Second, as being a most serious hindrance, absorbing a great deal of the attention when its utmost efforts are required for those things which are essential. Third, as not being required at all by a great proportion of those who need to acquire a foreign language. Fourth, as a thing that can be acquired with 1/100th part of the time which would be consumed at first, after the other parts of the study have been matured. Fifth, as being more liable to be mistaken by the beginner than the English character. If it be said, but how can it be avoided when there are no elementary books of the language in the English character? I answer, first, that I am here proposing a new system, and of course would have books prepared suitable to it. Second, that in many languages, as in those of Bengal, many books have already been prepared in this way. Third, that in many situations the student could, with the assistance of a native, easily provide himself with the first elementary books, without much loss of time, and certainly with much less expenditure of time, than by studying in the commonest ways with such books as are already provided. And fourthly, that if there is no alternative, we must of course begin by learning the native character, but still, if we follow out the other parts of the system here proposed, it will be much less a hindrance to him than to those who adopt the usual means, because he will seldom have to read any words but those which he knows, and then the strange character is comparatively a small hindrance. Of course, in applying the English character, the value of each letter must first be defined, as is now fully recognized as an essential principle, and which is always acted upon in the Bengal books. The letter A, for instance, has in English 7 distinct sounds, as in the words hat, most, all, many, America, yacht, make. In all the East Indian languages, the letter which represents the sound of RA in mast or long R, somewhat modified, represents the sound of RA in amuse or short A, and therefore this letter, with and without a long mark over it, should represent these two sounds, and be used whenever the corresponding characters are used or implied in the foreign word. With respect to the other sounds of it, some are unknown in certain languages, as for instance, the sounds of that letter in the words hat and yacht are unknown in any Asiatic language. No native Indian can pronounce the words hat and hot, but are under the necessity of substituting some other vocal sound for them, till they have learnt the true pronunciation. The other sounds of it will of course be represented by those English vowels which most properly represent them, only taking care to use the same letter to represent the long and short sound, distinguishing the former by a long mark over it. Thus the sound of E in hen and fet, which are properly the same sound pronounced long or short, are represented in the Indian languages by modifications of the same letter, and should therefore both be represented by E. With respect to the sounds which are either unknown in English or not represented by any one English letter, they should either be represented by a combination of English letters if possible, or if not by a letter or letters distinguished by a mark, as for instance one or more dots under them. There are, for instance, 4 letters that represent in the Tamil language the sound of our N, or some modification of it. One is precisely the sound of it, the tongue being placed in the same position as by us. This will be represented, of course, by Rn. The second is the same in sound, though represented by a different character, but it occurs only when preceding and combined with a certain other consonant. This may also be represented by a simple English N, as the sound is the same. The third has the sound of ny in English, and therefore should be represented by those consonants. The sound is that of rn in new. The fourth is a sound unknown in English. It is pronounced by the tongue being turned entirely back so that the under part of its tip touches the roof of the mouth. An n sounded with the tongue in this position is the sound required. This therefore should be represented by an n with a dot under it, the dot or dots being the invariable mark of a sound quite strange to an Englishman, so as to be the readiest warning to the student that the tongue must be placed in a position which is new to him. This is much preferable to the native character itself, because there can be no mistake about it, without any effort of memory, whereas the foreign character will always require the student to consider which of the several sounds of n it represents. It may be observed here that in general, probably in all cases, the languages of semi-civilized people that are written have an invariable sound for each character, so that there is no such difficulty in representing them by the English characters as there would be in representing English by some foreign character, on account of the vocal sounds being represented in different words by different vowels, as hat, yacht, many, all, etc., and grief, leaf, seed, previous, marine, receive, and homeopathy. In writing English, therefore, in a foreign character, there would be no alternative but to use a certain letter for each sound, however that sound is represented in English writing, and correct English spelling must be learnt afterwards. But these difficulties do not exist in applying the English character to represent the sounds of most of the written languages of semi-civilized nations. End of the Study of Living Languages, Part 1, by Sir Arthur Cotton. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater, recorded in London, England.